But first, I'm still with Talk's international editor, Isabel Oakeshott. You'll like this one, Isabel, or rather you won't. This is Angela Rayner's ludicrous workers' rights bill shortly to become law. This is typical socialism, typical Labour. They never understand where the boundaries are, where individuals should be left alone. They think that the power of the state should be limitless. Listen to this. So under this new act, this is, of course, is the brilliant act where at one point it contained the clause that no employer, company owner or boss would be able to phone or email or contact or text their staff after 6 p.m. This was shortly before it was explained to those Labourites, Ange and the gang, that actually the world doesn't work like that. You know, there are all sorts of jobs where people have to talk to their bosses. Horror of horror after 6 p.m. Try being a journalist. I'm sorry, news editor. It's 6:05. You can't call me now. Try that, all you young journalists, or rather don't. But anyway, they're to get rid of that rather extreme clause, by the way. But it is still a very extreme act that makes life very difficult for companies, for bosses. Now, this, though, is awful. Enforcement officers for this law, for the Workers' Rights Act, will be given powers of arrest so they can arrest people. But worse than that, they'll be given powers to force themselves into people's homes, to actually, like the police, to burst into people's homes and search them for documents, laptops, computers, that sort of thing, to see, amid their investigations, to see whether or not these bosses, these company owners or whatever, have been obeying the terms of the Workers' Rights Act. So basically, what this lot want to do is, if you're not a lovely, caring, sharing boss who gives their workers everything they want, you know, work from home, 3-day weeks, you know, £5 million a year kind of thing. If you don't do that, that's going to be against the law. But the idea that essentially non-coppers, officials, enforcement officials for this act can burst into people's homes, arrest them, take their laptops. I mean, that's something out of North Korea, isn't it?
Well, there's an awful lot about Britain that seems like something out of North Korea at the moment. And, you know, it cast back a few years. If you sort of said this could happen to me, I'd have said, no way, you know, that'll never happen. This is ridiculous. You know, someone's exaggerating here. But I 100% believe it would happen. You know, we've already seen unbelievable infringements of people's liberties to say what they think. You know, I know you're talking later on the show about the poor fellow who was sacked as a result of condemning a terror organisation, Hamas, because that was insufficiently inclusive, apparently. You know, the whole cult of inclusivity now means we need to be inclusive of actual murderers, apparently. So I can well believe that, given an inch, these awful enforcement officials, whoever they're going to be, will absolutely relish their little moment of power to burst into someone's home and try and grab a few scrappy bits of paper that might give them some evidence against a boss. What is the effect of this? The effect of this is multifold, isn't it? But in one case, it will be that people will just be a lot more reluctant to hire, to take new people on. I think it's going to have a very, very chilling effect on recruitment. I think bosses will become an awful lot more discerning about who they take on. They'll become much more risk averse. It may end up being much more of a case of taking on people that, you know, have had a personal recommendation. Who do you know? Because who wants to take a risk on a total stranger under these circumstances? And also, I think it sets up a really artificial us and them situation between workers and employers. I mean, hopefully, most workers aspire one day to also be part of the managerial group in a company or become bosses themselves. But this sets up barriers between those who are in those positions of power and those subordinate to them, and creates a kind of fear culture. And it's the last thing that is going to create a booming economy. It just isn't.
Yeah, so this is Angela Rayner's baby. This is her pet project, this workers' rights bill. In fairness to Kastama and the gang, they have been watering it down almost daily, because when it started out in life, it was just extraordinary. As I say, you know, bosses can't talk to their staff after 6 p.m. Bosses can have no say in whether or not workers demand to work from home. If they ask for it, they have to be given it, and that people could be hired and then sue the bosses for wrongful dismissal almost instantly. 1 day later, they could sue for wrongful dismissal. I don't know if the guy turned up, or if they didn't turn up for work, or they were obviously drunk or something like that, they can immediately sue the boss. So in other words, it is completely skewed against the bosses, against company owners. And once again, this will hit small companies more than big companies. But I think it feeds into what people like Angela Rayner, their worldview. Now, the fact of the matter is, I hate to break it to members of the Labour Party, members of the Labour government, but you will find that most people who own companies, most bosses, department heads, are actually decent people. And most of them operate with their staff on a decent human level. People like Angela Rayner can't understand that. They only see bosses in terms of Victorian robber barons who are evilly exploiting their poor, long-suffering workers. That's the way they see it. So we've got here a kind of ridiculous act, an anachronistic act, sort of based on a Victorian view of what factory exploiting bosses were like. It isn't commensurate with the modern world, and it is pernicious, and it is bad for business. Once again, this government is so bad for business. Add that to the national insurance hike and all the other terrible measures that are making it so difficult to make a living in this country right now. Labour are just catastrophic for business, aren't they?
Well, here's another point, and I actually, of course, I completely agree with you that the vast majority of employers are good, decent people who treat workers well, because that's how you get the best out of workers. But equally, it isn't good for workers to feel that they have absolutely no risk whatsoever of being fired or ever being hauled up or criticised or challenged in any way whatsoever over substandard work. That doesn't produce the best outcome for a company and therefore for the economy either. There has to be a bit of tension there. You know, as an employee, you have to have a bit of fear that this may not last forever and that you're going to have to stay on your toes and perform well. And one of the byproducts of a bill like this is it gives workers so much protection that actually they're probably going to be quite disincentivized to give of their best at all times, because they've got far too much power, I would say.
Yeah, you're right about that. Traditionally, what essentially was the incentive to do what your bosses wanted and to try to do it very well, the incentive was not to get sacked. Yes. Because if the boss gave you an instruction, or the company owner gave you an instruction, you completely ignored it and went down the pub, you would get sacked. But under the Workers' Rights Act, you won't get sacked. The boss, I'd say, he or she, will end up in jail because they broke the law or something. It completely warps the relationship between the boss and the worker. And as I say, I don't think it doesn't understand that these people, the Angela Rayners of this world, don't understand the relationships between bosses and workers. It isn't all attrition. It isn't all hatred. It is working together to make a living.
Exactly that. That's what I mean by saying it sets up this artificial tension between a boss and someone that they're paying to do a job. You know, mostly this is a relationship of cooperation and positive cooperation. Otherwise, it's miserable for everybody. So I don't think it's necessary. I don't understand what is the impetus to bring this in. Where are the the industrial scale abuses taking place that aren't currently addressed by all the many rights and regulations that we have, because workers in the UK are very, very well protected, actually. I mean, employment law is pretty positive as far as a worker is concerned in the UK relative to many other countries. Even, by the way, America, the benefits that you get automatically, the rights that accrue to you, but the holidays, the parental leave, on and on it goes. It's pretty generous already, and I just don't see what the actual need for this is. Where is the evil that is being addressed here? Where's the evidence that it's necessary?
And I think we should campaign very hard for this. The only people who are allowed to arrest people, walk into people's homes and search their homes, seize documents, seize computers, are police officers, not government agents. We don't want that, do we?
Absolutely not. And I can't even believe we're having this discussion, actually. I can't believe we're having this discussion. What is happening to our country?
I'll tell you what, Isabel, that's what happens when your Prime Minister turns out to be Kim Jong-Starmer. So there you go. Thank you very much for an excellent hour. You'll be back tomorrow. That's Isabel Oakeshott, our international editor.